Hello and welcome to another Bible study on the Prophecy Depot program. I'm your host, Dr. Bill Salus, and today I will be sequencing Psalm 83, the Arab-Israeli conflict, followed by Ezekiel 38, the Russian coalition that invades Israel, followed then by the Seven-Year Tribulation Period when the wrath of God comes upon the planet. I believe each event sets the stage for the one that follows, and each event that follows gets more powerful. And there's probably not a lot of time span in between them as they come in rapid succession, in my estimation. If you look at the timeline above, you see the church age, the pre-tribulation gap, and the 7-year tribulation period. Now, we're presently in the church age. You see that would conclude with the rapture, but it's not the rapture that starts the tribulation. It's a covenant in Daniel 9, chapter 9, verse 27, which we'll be going over a little bit later in this program. So I believe Psalm 83 could happen in the church age. This is my educated guess. Ezekiel 38 would probably happen in the gap, both of them being pre-tribulation prophecies, and the tribulation period. Now you'll notice I have a caveat on the bottom about the rapture. It says the rapture is imminent, and it could happen at any time. Afterward, all the unfulfilled pre-tribulation prophecies would then shift to the gap column from the church age into the gap. So what I'm saying there is that I'm not sure Psalm 83 could happen before the rapture. It could happen before, during, or after. As could Ezekiel 38 could happen before, during, or after the rapture. But in my estimation, this could be how these prophecies come in sequence. So stay tuned as we explore this study further. So let's start by taking a look at the inner circle map of Psalm 83. This inner circle map overlays the ancient names of the Psalm 83 6-8 confederation over their modern day counterparts. We need to take into consideration that when the psalmist wrote, he used the ancient names that were familiar to the people of his day. Now, while these names of these geographical locations have changed many times throughout history, the geographical territory remains the same. And it's a geographical territory in which we are mostly interested. So who could we identify them with as today, their modern-day counterparts? You'd have Lebanon, Jordan, Palestinians, Saudi Arabia, Syria, Iraq, probably Egypt is in there, Gaza, and the Sinai. Now all of these populations from these countries, these territories, came together in the War of 1948 against the Arab-Israeli War of 1948, so we've already seen them rear their ugly head in a confederacy to wipe out Israel, which is the goal, according to Psalm 83, verse 4. It says, they have said, this confederacy, come and let us cut them off from being a nation, that the name of Israel can be remembered no more. So now let's turn our attention to the outer ring map of Ezekiel 38, which superimposes the historic names Meshech, Tubal, Togarmah, Gomer, you see them up there, upon their present-day equivalents, and the arrows depict the location of these coalition members. Who would they be today in their modern-day equivalents? The general consensus is as follows. Among the scholars, you've got Russia, maybe including some of the southern steppes of Russia. You also have Turkey, Iran, Ethiopia, Sudan, Somalia, Libya, Algeria, Tunisia, perhaps Morocco, and some even suggest Germany may be part of that. Now, their motive is different than that of Psalm 83. They want to come together to take great plunder, to take great booty. We find that out in Ezekiel 38:12. So you see a distinct difference of location here. These are countries that have never don't share common borders with Israel. They've never had an ancient hatred, like the Psalm 83 countries that do share common borders with Israel. But at some point, they will coalesce to come to invade Israel for plunder and for booty. Now, although it's a minority view, there are some who try to connect Psalm 83 with Ezekiel 38, but we're going to look at some differences here, distinct differences. We've already looked at one. The Psalm 83 countries involve an inner circle of countries that share common borders with Israel. They have hated Israel from time immemorial, but that's different than the outer ring of nations in Ezekiel 38 that share no common borders with Israel. But there's a few more differences we'll look at here. There's different motives, different defeats, and different results. The motives of Psalm 83, they want to destroy the nation of Israel and take over the land of Israel, the promised land. that's different than Ezekiel 38. We looked at they want to take great plunder and booty as a result of invading Israel. The different defeats, you got the Israeli Defense Forces will be empowered to defeat the Arab foes of Psalm 83 militarily. Yes, the IDF exists in fulfillment of Bible prophecy. But the Lord supernaturally will defeat the invaders of Ezekiel 38 through a great earthquake, flooding rains, hailstone, fire, and brimstone. And the end results will be different because at the end of Psalm 83, the ancient hatred that's been harbored will be finished between the Arabs and the Jews. Ezekiel 38, we're told in verse 39:7, that God will make his holy name known in the midst of his people Israel. We'll look at that in a little moment. Since 2008, I have been teaching that Psalm 83 is a pre-tribulation future war prophecy. My latest teachings on that you can see are in the book, The Future War Prophecies, book and DVD you see on the image. But since that time, there have been some who have come out with different interpretations. And they are only, some think it's only a lament prayer, just a prayer. Some think it was fulfilled historically in 2 Chronicles 20, or maybe the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, maybe even the 1967 Six-Day War. We already looked at it as a part of Ezekiel 38. Now there's differences we shared. Is it part of the Armageddon campaign? That's another viewpoint. Now, I take all these different viewpoints very seriously because I don't want to mislead people. But as such, I can show you a flurry of articles and a video that you can watch refuted and rebutted these different viewpoints. If you go to my website at prophecydepot.com, you can find these following articles, free online to read. Why Psalm 83 is a prayer and a future war prophecy, that's one of them. Another one is Psalm 83 is the final Arab-Israeli war, all at prophecydepot.com. Another one is Psalm 83 historically fulfilled in 2 Chronicles 20. Zechariah 12, the war before Armageddon. I tie Zechariah 12 to Psalm 83 as the climactic conclusion of Psalm 83. We're getting into that in this program as well. Also, these are free online. There's a video. If you go to our YouTube channel, Prophecy Depot Ministries, Bill Salus, search why Psalm 83 is an unfulfilled and standalone prophecy. So I invite you to check out these articles and this video if you have any doubts about Psalm 83 being a future unfulfilled pre-tribulation war prophecy. So let's take a look at the Psalm 83 Confederacy by their ancient names. This is going to be important because you're going to see in the next slide that these populations are confronted in battle by the Israeli Defense Forces who exist, like I said, in fulfillment of Bible prophecy. You have the tents of Edom actually listed first in the Confederacy, the tents of Edom. I'll explain why that's significant in just a moment. Moab, Ammon, Assyria, Gebal, Tyre, Philistia, Amalek, Hagarenes, Ishmaelites. Again, most all of these countries are being confronted in unfulfilled future war prophecies that we'll be looking at in the next slide. Now, the tents of Edom identified first in this confederacy in a habitation condition. Tents can represent refugee conditions, and the Edomites actually have ethnical representation in the Palestinians today. Here's a picture of the Palestinian refugees in 1949 after the Arab-Israeli War of 1948. I believe that's when tents of Edom became a reality, setting the stage for the Psalm 83 prophecy. In modern day equivalents, we'll take a look at them again. Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Gaza where the Hamas are, Lebanon where the Hezbollah are. These are the countries and populations that went to war in 1948, and that's when the Palestinian refugees, the tents of Edom, became a reality. Now let's take a look at the prophecies involving the Israeli Defense Forces. I invite you to take a screenshot of this and study these prophecies. I do have a caveat on the bottom there, the number 1, IDF versus Iran. Iran's not actually in Psalm 83, nor are we really told that the IDF is involved in this Jeremiah 49 prophecy of Elam. But it's interesting because it's a different prophecy than the Ezekiel 38 prophecy that also involves Iran, so you might want to take a look at that. But clearly IDF versus Syria in Isaiah 17:9. I'm not going to read all these to you, but take a screenshot and check these out. I'm going to show you a couple of them in just a moment. Really, the IDF is involved in going to battle and defeating these Arab foes, and we'll take a look at that in just a moment. So I want to draw your attention on this list to number 9 down at the bottom, the Israeli Defense Forces versus their Arab neighbors. Supporting scriptures would be Zechariah 12, verse 6, Ezekiel 28, and Jeremiah 12. I believe this would be the climactic conclusion of the Arab-Israeli conflict, the conclusion of the Psalm 83 scenario. I'm going to take a look at Zechariah 12 for a moment. We're told in verse 2 that someday the peoples round about the Arab countries of Psalm 83, the Psalm 83 Confederacy, they're going to lay a final siege against Judah and against Jerusalem. And when that happens, it says, "Behold, I, the Lord, will make Jerusalem a cup of trembling," or dizziness, drunkenness, or intoxication in some translations, "unto all the people round about when they shall be in the siege, both against Judah and against Jerusalem." And when that happens, the Lord is going to empower the Israeli Defense Forces, Zechariah 12:6, to do the following. It says, "In that day when they're laying a final siege, those peoples round about, I'll make the governors, captains of Judah," use that as the IDF, "like a fire pan in the woodpile, and like a fiery torch in the sheaves. And they shall devour all the surrounding peoples on the right hand and on the left, but Jerusalem shall be inhabited again in her own place." Now we notice it's the Israeli Defense Forces in fulfillment of Zechariah 12 here. It's going to defeat those Arab foes around them on the left hand and on the right hand. Here's another look at who they are on the right hand and on the left hand and on the right. Those Arab foes, they're involved in the Psalm 83 Confederacy. Now, if you have any doubts about that, a lot of people think Zechariah 12 is part of Armageddon. Zechariah 14, Revelation 16, Revelation 19, they connect to Zechariah 12. I would draw your attention again to the article I've written at prophecydepot.com called Zechariah 12, the War Before Armageddon. So when it comes to making the connection between Psalm 83 and Zechariah 12, my good friend Dr. David Reagan writes the following in his article called The Wars of the End Times Part 2. Here's what David says. He says, "The first war of Israeli extermination described in Psalm 83. Psalm 83 states that the immediate neighbors of Israel will launch a war for the purpose of wiping out Israel as a nation. The outcome of the war is not specifically stated in Psalm 83, but we know from other scriptures that Israel will be victorious. For example, Zechariah 12:6 says that in the end times Israel will be like a firepot among pieces of wood and a flaming torch among sheaves, so that they will consume on the right hand and on the left hand all the surrounding peoples." Again, all the peoples round about, not the nations at large, but the surrounding peoples. So he makes a connection as well. So now let's take a look at some of the details of how exactly the IDF will become a fiery torch and devour its enemies on the right hand and the left. We'll start with the Palestinian prognosis. In Obadiah 1 verses 18 we read the following: "The house of Jacob shall be a fire," that would be the IDF, "and the house of Joseph a flame," also the IDF, "but the house of Esau, the tents of Edom, the Palestinians, shall be stubble, and no survivor shall remain of the house of Esau, for the Lord has spoken." So keeping with the theme of the fiery torch devouring the people on the right hand like sheaves, you have the theme here, the fire and the flame devouring and reducing the Palestinians to stubble, and no survivor shall remain in the house of Esau. Let's move over and talk about Jordan. You have Ammon involved, that would be northern Jordan, and they're in Psalm 83 Confederacy. Although they have a fragile peace treaty with Israel now, that is not, we will not find that in these next two prophecies that we're going to look at. Jeremiah 49:2, an unfulfilled future war prophecy. "Therefore, behold, the days are coming, says the Lord, that I will cause to be heard an alarm of war in Rabbah of the Ammonites." That would be Amman, Jordan, the capital of Jordan. "An alarm of war in Rabbah. It shall be a desolate mound, and her villages shall be burned with fire. Then Israel shall take possession of his inheritance, says the Lord." Now that land there is within the metes and bounds of the promised land, which we're told in Genesis 15:18. It's from the river of Egypt, the great river of Egypt, probably the Nile, the river Euphrates, which courses through modern-day Iraq and Syria. Now the camera angle of this detailed battle, we turn our attention to Zephaniah chapter 2, verses 8 and 9. Israel annexes Jordan as a result of this war, which they have a policy of doing when they win wars. They annex territory. Joshua did it 3,500 years ago. King David and King Solomon did it about 3,000 years ago. Israel Defense Forces. Israel did it again in 1967 after the Six-Day War. Here's what we find out in Zephaniah chapter 2. I've heard the reports of Moab, that would be central Jordan, and the insults of the people of Ammon, northern Jordan, with which they have reproached my people and made arrogant threats against their borders. For doing that, this will happen. The residue of my people shall plunder them, and the remnant of my people shall possess them. So in other words, the IDF shall plunder them, and the Israelis shall possess that territory. So let's turn our attention back to our list of the IDF and pre-tribulation prophecies. I'll be explaining in the next slide why they're pre-tribulation events. We looked at number 4, the IDF versus the Palestinians. Number 6, IDF versus Jordan. Number 9, the IDF versus the Arab neighbors in Zechariah 12. But take a screenshot of this and don't take my word for it. Read these prophecies. IDF versus Syria, number 2. Lebanon, number 3. The Gaza, number 5. Egypt, number 7. Saudi Arabia, number 8. You'll see that these are all confrontations of the populations by their ancient names that are listed in Psalm 83. So now let's take a look at why the IDF wars are pre-tribulation events. We can logically deduce this by understanding the tribulation period and how it is compartmentalized into the first and the second half, each one comprising 3.5 years. In the first half, the Israeli Defense Forces are living at peace because the covenant of Daniel 9:27 has awarded them that possibility. It's a pseudo-peace because in the middle of it, the Antichrist is going to go in the temple and desecrate it. And then we get into the second half of the tribulation. We'll talk about what's going on there in just a moment. In the first half, they're not fighting anybody because due to this condition of peace they're living in. Not fighting off the Arabs of Psalm 83. Therefore, that would have to be done some other time. They're not fighting in the second half of the tribulation because they're fleeing from the Antichrist because he's going to start a genocidal campaign against the Jewish people. A final genocidal attempt, and we're told in Zechariah 13:8, that 2/3 of the Jews in the land will be cut off. But in Zechariah 13:9, we find out that 1/3, a faithful remnant, will survive. So not fighting in the first half, not fighting in the second half, not fighting Ezekiel 38, either that's the Lord's doing, so we're going to find that out in just a moment. And they're certainly not fighting in the millennium, because there's no more wars, according to Micah 4 verse 3. So they have to be doing these wars in the pre-tribulation period. So we've looked at Psalm 83 and how it connects with Zechariah 12 and how the IDF would be empowered to defeat their Arab foes and end the Arab-Israeli conflict militarily. And we also discovered why it's a pre-tribulation event. Now with Psalm 83 out of the way, in the aftermath, let's see how it sets the stage for the Ezekiel 38 invasion of Israel. Those countries that were not listed in Ezekiel 38, the inner circle of countries, will be out of the way. Now it's time for the Russian invasion with its coalition to advance for plunder and booty into Israel, who will then be a safe-dwelling country at that point. We'll look at that's one of the prerequisites that we have to look at in the next slide. Okay, so let's look at the prerequisite conditions that Israel must be dwelling in Ezekiel 38, verse 7 through 12, to understand why it's important that Psalm 83 finds fulfillment prior to Ezekiel 38 to set the stage for Ezekiel 38. We're told that the Jews must be regathered from the nations in the latter years, brought back from the sword of persecution, into a rebirthed Israel which had long been desolate. Put check marks in those boxes because that has happened. But there are some other ones that I don't believe have happened yet that Psalm 83 will set the stage for. And they are as follows. The Jews must be a peaceful people, living in a land of unwalled villages. They must be dwelling securely without walls, bars, nor gates, having silver and gold, and acquired livestock and goods, possessing the great plunder and booty that Russia is going to bring its coalition for. And that Israel does not exist just yet. It will after Psalm 83 in my estimation. The Hebrew words for dwelling safely, securely show up 2 times in verse 8, 1, and verse 11 is the second time. The Hebrew word is Yeshav B'tak. It defines a security that Israel can have because they've eliminated the enemy threat around them. They can tear down the walls, bars, and gates and be a peaceful people. Now, some people suggest, well, this Trump 20-point peace plan, Gaza peace plan, will perhaps create this security and peace that Israel desperately needs. What does the Bible actually say will happen to procure this peace? We turn our attention to Ezekiel 28, verses 24 through 26. We find out the reason Israel does not dwell securely is in verse 24. Because there's a pricking briar and a painful thorn around Israel. That's those countries around about. A pricking briar and a painful thorn. But again, it says here in Ezekiel 20, verse 24, and there shall no longer be a pricking briar or a painful thorn for the house of Israel from among those who are around them, who despise them. Then they shall know that I am the Lord their God. So this is why Israel can't dwell securely, because they got to deal with that Psalm 83 issue. Here's how that's going to come down. Verses 25 and 26 of Ezekiel 28 says the following. Thus says the Lord God, when I have gathered the house of Israel from the peoples among them, whom they are scattered, and have hallowed in them in the sight of the Gentiles, then they will dwell in their own land, and which I have given to my servant Jacob. And they will dwell safely, Yeshav. They will build houses, and they will plant vineyards. Yes, they will dwell securely, Yeshav. When I execute judgments on all those around them who despise them, then they shall know that I am the Lord their God. So the peace is going to come when judgments are executed upon those around them who despise them. And when those nations round about, we looked at in Zechariah 12, they are in Psalm 83. Judgments have to be executed upon them to enable the Jews to end the Arab-Israeli conflict and dwell securely. So that's how this peace is going to be procured. The Trump peace plan may have some positive effects, but it would be temporary at best, because ultimately Zechariah 12 has to find fulfillment, and the conclusion of Psalm 83 has to occur to set the stage for Ezekiel 38, in my estimation. So let's discuss a couple reasons why Ezekiel 38 and 39 are likely pre-tribulation events. Unlike Psalm 83, where the IDF, the Israeli military, is involved, the Israeli military is not involved in Ezekiel 38, nor are the American forces, but God supernaturally himself intervenes to stop this formidable advance of Russia's coalition through a great earthquake. This great earthquake is going to cause panic among the troops that are invading, because they are from different countries and speak different languages. So it says, every man's sword will then turn against brother. There will be pestilence and bloodshed, flooding rain, great hailstones, fire and brimstone. There's clearly going to be a supernatural intervention. The world will see it that way. And the reason for that is that God tells us in Ezekiel 39:7, after that is all done, I will make my holy name known in the midst of my people Israel, and I will not let them profane my holy name any more. And the nation shall know I am the Lord, the Holy One in Israel. It requires it to be in Israel, the Holy One in Israel, and my people Israel to exist, not be taken out in the Psalm 83 war. So God exists. God is going to use a marquee event of the end times to put the world on official notice that he is the covenant-keeping God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, promise-keeping God of those who put their faith in Jesus Christ. This is a major event, and this is one of the reasons I believe it's a pre-tribulation event, because I do believe God would want to, now this is one of the weaker reasons, but I do believe God would want to put the world on notice that he is the covenant-keeping God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob before the tribulation starts, so they have ample time to make the decision for Christ before the Antichrist comes along and tries to deceive them to worship him. Okay, so now let's discuss the most convincing reason that Ezekiel 38 and 39 are likely pre-tribulation events. Now, people like Dr. Ron Rhodes, Dr. David Reagan, Dr. Arnold Fruchtenbaum, myself, and many others use this as a convincing argument, the burning of the weapons for 7 years. In the aftermath of the divine intervention by God to defeat the Russian coalition we just talked about, we find that the Jews will actually be burning the enemy weapons for 7 years, converting it to fuel. We're told in Ezekiel 39:9 the following: and those who dwell in the cities of Israel will go out and set on fire and burn the weapons, both the shields and bucklers, the bows and arrows, the javelins and spears, and they will make fires with them for 7 years. Now that 7-year time frame is very important to consider when you look at the tribulation period. We'll take another look at that timetable I showed earlier. We see that in the first 3.5 years of the tribulation, that they could certainly be burning the weapons, converting it to fuel, because they're living in a condition of pseudo-peace, but not in that second half, because Remember, they're fleeing from the Antichrist genocidal campaign at the second half of the tribulation for 3.5 years. If anything, they'd grab a weapon to defend themselves. So they could actually burn weapons for the first 3.5 years prior to the tribulation, pre-tribulation, 3.5 years in the first half of the tribulation, but that would abruptly stop at the midpoint of the tribulation. So therefore, I think that the conclusion of Ezekiel 38 and 39 likely would be 3.5 years before the tribulation period. Now, moreover, when you consider the first 3.5 years of the tribulation, when Israel is living in that peace, it really doesn't make sense. That shoe doesn't fit that the most massive Mideast invasion of history, the Russian coalition of Ezekiel 38, it doesn't really make sense that that would fit in that particular 3.5 year time frame. That Israel's at peace for all indications. Yes, they certainly could be burning the weapons, but not a time for a massive invasion, highly unlikely. Nor would it really, should Ezekiel 38 probably fit in the second half during the Armageddon campaign for various reasons, and I put them forward in an article you can get at prophecydepot.com called Are Ezekiel 38 and 39 in Armageddon? So not likely that Ezekiel 38 and 39 would happen in the first half of the tribulation, nor in the second half during the Armageddon campaign. Certainly not in the millennium, because we're told in Micah 4 verse 3 that the swords will be beaten into plowshares, the spears will be turned into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. So there'll be no more wars in the millennium. So now that we've seen how Psalm 83 likely sets the stage for Ezekiel 38, and how Ezekiel 38 is the event God uses to put the world before the tribulation on notice that He's God, the covenant-keeping God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, promise-keeping God of Jesus Christ. Now let's turn our attention to the covenant that starts the tribulation period. So before we look at the proof text scriptures of Daniel 9:27 and Isaiah 20:15 regarding the covenant that triggers the tribulation period, let's do a little recap. By the time we get to that stage, Psalm 83 would have happened, and the Israeli Defense Forces would have proven themselves to be an exceedingly great army. Ezekiel 38 would have happened, and God would have intervened and put the world on notice He's God. We're told in the aftermath, not only are they burning weapons for 7 years, but they're burying the dead for 7 months, and they're gaining world renown at this point in time. So they're going to be on a force to be reckoned with. They're going to be on a fast track to want to build their temple. And then the covenant's going to be, they're going to be willing to covenant in order to do that. So let's turn our attention to the scriptures of Daniel 9:27. We'll start with that. We're told in Daniel 9:27, then he, that would be the Antichrist, shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week. But in the middle of the week he shall bring an end to sacrifice and offering, and the wing of abomination shall be one who makes desolate, even until the consummation, which is determined, is poured out on the desolate. So we're given very important information here, but not everything we need to know, but we're told it'll be a 7-year term, confirmed by the Antichrist. It'll enable temple sacrifices. The Antichrist waits it out in the midpoint of the 7-year period. So then, as important as these details are in Daniel 9:27, they only give us half the story. We need to find out, well, who are the many, the other signatory that Daniel refers to, and what is the motivation that drives Israel to even want a covenant in the first place. Now we turn our attention back to Isaiah 28 verses 14 and 15 to get those additional details, and here's what we're told. Isaiah 28 verses 14 and 15. Therefore, hear the word of the Lord, you scornful men who rule this people who are in Jerusalem, because you have said, we have made a covenant with death, and with Sheol we are in agreement. When the overflowing scourge passes through, it will not come to us, for we have made lies our refuge, and under falsehood we have hidden ourselves. So we find out that there's a scourge being perpetrated by death in Sheol that's going to prohibit Israel's ability to build their temple and move forward with their next plans. So we get these additional details. The other signatory is death in Sheol. Israel's motivation is to avoid the overflowing scourge, and Israel's participation involves lies and falsehood. In other words, it's politically expedient for Israel to sign on to this covenant. Now, I'm not going to get into all the details of who death and Sheol are and what the overflowing scourge is that they're perpetrating, but I do cover all this in my book and DVD called The Last Prophecies, the prophecies in the first half of the tribulation period. So in conclusion, we've taken a look at the sequence of Psalm 83 and how that can conclude the Arab-Israeli conflict and eliminate that painful thorn and pricking briar that surrounds Israel, those countries round about, the inner circle of Psalm 83, thus enabling Israel to become a vineyard planting, home building, safe dwelling nation that we find as a prerequisite conditions in Ezekiel 38, whereby God stops that Russian invasion and shows the world he's a covenant-keeping God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob before the tribulation period. And we've looked at the Jews wanting to move forward and build their temple and having to sign a covenant in order to do that. And that's then we get ourselves started into the tribulation period. So this is how I see these things and lay them out, and I hope I've explained them adequately for you. And I hope you've enjoyed this study. So stay tuned for another one coming up soon. I really want to thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, and if you have not already done so, please consider subscribing to our YouTube page at Prophecy Depot Ministries. Bill Salus, you can go on YouTube and search Prophecy Depot Ministries. Also, take the time to visit our product page at prophecydepot.com. You'll find my books and DVDs there. We even have bundle deals, discounts of books and DVDs for you. While you're there, also check out our Spiritual Survival Kit for those left behind thumb drive. It's specifically designed for your loved ones who might get left behind so they can know what's forthcoming in the days in which they'll be living. It would include a Bible, some letters of instructions from me to them, my books and DVDs for the Here to Eternity series, the Now Prophecies, what could happen now at the present time, the Next Prophecies, what has a few preconditions but are stage setting, could happen after the Now Prophecies. The Now Prophecies have no more preconditions. The Last Prophecies, which include the prophecies in the first half of the tribulation, the Final Prophecies, which include the prophecies in the second half and final half of the tribulation, and then we conclude the series with the Millennium Prophecies and the New Jerusalem. Additionally, while you're there, you'll see my new book and DVD called The Future War Prophecies. And you see some of the topics that are discussed there: the First War of Iran, the war we talked about in this video with Israel and Syria, the proxy war that shakes Israel, Psalm 83, Ezekiel 38. You see the list of these different topics up there. Please visit and consider purchasing this book and DVD as well.